Welcome to the Gen AI podcast, where the future meets fun and tech talk trends. Get ready to dive into the world of artificial intelligence like never before. Your hosts, Dale, Alan, Greg, and Val, are about to take you on a wild ride through the AI universe. So, buckle up, tune in, and let the AI adventure begin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Gen AI podcast. We're back, and there has once again been a lot that has happened since the last episode, but it always is good to be joined by Al. How are you doing, Al?
I am doing great. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very good, thank you. I'm very good. I'm very excited for this episode because there's a few things we want to unpick. But more importantly, as we always start off with, health and safety matters. So is Greg and Val all doing good to your knowledge?
Yeah, I think they're both still out there in the world doing their thing.
Shout out
It's
to...
funny how Greg and I haven't overlapped in an episode for a bit now.
No, it's great, actually. I think the world would implode when both of you are on the episode again, and then it would explode again when Val comes on. So, yeah, I don't know where...
Greg and I have been on an episode together before,
Yes.
A couple of them, right? I think the real event will be when Val shows up.
Jeez, that'll be huge, cataclysmic. Yeah, I think we'll probably go full Mandalorian or something like that. We'll geek out.
Yes.
But
It'll
anyway, let's crack on. Let's give the people what they want. Let's spar a bit. There's lots of different topics we can jump all over the show with. I think particularly if we look at the news, the key one for me that I want to unpick is GraphGen and really how we can start getting specifically in the construction world and projects world, the ability to have self-serve reporting. And I know you're uncomfortable with this because this isn't a sales podcast, but you had AI Day from Enplan last week. And some of the stuff you released there for me...
As the bags under my eyes attest.
Yeah, but it was truly, truly exciting. And genuinely, this is not a sales podcast, but it would be remiss of us not to discuss some of the things that you announced and shared with the world last week. And so I know there'll be people that listen to this podcast that wouldn't have had the opportunity to see it or hear it. So what were the highlights? And let's unpick it from there.
Yeah, so and our marketing machine is going to go full blast, and we'll have snippets and all the usual stuff that you can imagine a marketing team will produce for this kind of event. But really, we collected basically the last 6 months of development from our research team, and this is the only moment that I will brag in this whole thing is that our research team is called Enplan's Experimental Research Division. Which spells out nerd, and it was the proudest moment of my life. It is also my biggest achievement is naming nerd. I don't think I've done anything better than that in my life. And it's going to be hard to top that one. But yeah, some things from nerd, some things from the product teams. I think the interesting ones are... let's go in order. I think auto report, which actually we had announced before, but we sort of figured out that we would put it in. And auto report is basically a platform where, and this is where it gets confusing, right? Because if you say reporting, a lot of people think about dashboards.
Yep.
And we have dashboards about risk, etc., in our product anyway. And you can build your own customizable dashboard as well, but the reporting in auto report is, those 200-page works of art sometimes that people have to put together on a monthly basis, etc., trying to just automate all of that. I think for me that one is exciting because I have never heard anyone say this is something that I love doing, and I really wish there was no opportunity to have reporting automated. So I'm very excited about that. yeah, I mean, obviously it's all powered by our agent, Barry. So we made some announcements about that. But really, like the core of AI Day was things that are centered around our GraphGen model. So we announced GraphGen about a year ago. In fact, GraphGen V2, not to be confused with Gen 3 from... and this is where, like, we name things internally, and then we find that 2 weeks later someone announces a thing with a similar name. But there's Gen 3 from One Runway, which is also incredibly exciting, right? Like, I don't know if you've seen the videos from Gen 3, but those are incredible. Anyway, GraphGen is a model that is multimodal text plus schedule, effectively. So you can plug in any Gantt chart, and I really do mean anything, because it is just open input. Basically, the schedule's part of the prompt. And you give it a prompt and you ask it for things, right? And so we demonstrated a couple of use cases which are going to end up in our products. So we have this, we call it Schedule AI, where there's a couple of use cases, like, can you get GraphGen to compare two schedules? Can you get GraphGen to just critique a schedule for things that, I'm not going to say schedule integrity because that is more mechanical, DCMA kind of stuff. But if you think of things that should have been connected, or things that have connections that shouldn't be there, or, oh, you're missing a whole stream of activities that make sense in this type of work, or your WBS looks weird. Basically the kind of stuff that if you put a schedule in front of an experienced planner, they'll be able to tell you this doesn't feel quite right. And you kind of get that out of the model with the right prompts. And so we're putting all this stuff in a experimental section of our products called Schedule AI, unimaginatively. And then I guess like the superstar for GraphGen is just schedule generation. So we figured we can get it to a decent enough quality now that we're going to release it in a couple of months as a product on its own. I mean, it'll probably integrate with our platform, right? You generate a schedule, you can probably also upload it for risk analysis and everything else. But we thought we would set it free. So basically, any document, any text, right? I gave the example of copy pasting an RFP for a hydrogen plant. And what you get out is a fully functional XCR file with a schedule in it, with duration, resources, and I guess the added benefit is that when we release this, the schedule that you get automatically already passes all of the schedule integrity checks, because GraphGen will be self-critiquing internally. But we tried it with a lot of weird stuff. Like at one point, I pasted in a lasagna recipe and it gave me a Gantt chart on how to make a lasagna. It's probably not the kind of Gantt chart that you would follow because it was like 400 activities. And because of all the schedules that we trained GraphGen on, which are, construction, infrastructure, engineering, that sort of stuff, there were things like make a risk assessment for the lasagna, inspect the oven. And I'm like, you probably don't need to do those things if you're making a lasagna. So it's not truly generic and general, but for the domain, I think it is good enough, and you will always edit those schedules anyway, right? You're never gonna, and if you do, then we have a conversation about the morality of it to be had, but you'll never just submit blindly a schedule, right? And there are things that will not be captured in the documents that get uploaded, right? But that for me, that's the exciting one, because it means that then instead of spending time in P6 as a planner, and I insist on using the term planner rather than scheduler. I know that our US or North American listeners, we have one listener in Canada and we're rooting for you.
Shout out to Ricardo.
Yeah. Usually prefer the term scheduler, but for me the term scheduler is too much connected to like you're drawing lines in P6, and I really don't think that should be the job, right? The job should be thinking about what are we building and how are we building it. and planning the work, and so you can do more of that and more planning, less scheduling, I guess. Anyway, I hope this didn't sound too salesy. It's a bit of a summary of what we announced. The last one that I'm super excited about that broke down mid demo, not because of us, but thanks to Vodafone and the Wi-Fi in the room, is Barry Connect. So we've got that agent Barry that up until now has lived inside our product, but really doesn't even make sense, right? If Barry can make reports, it can call all the different tools that it has available, it can interact with GraphGen, then why not just give it access to email, WhatsApp, and Teams meetings and all that kind of stuff?
Absolutely. I don't think it sounds too salesy. I think it's really, really exciting. So let's make it less salesy as well. I'm going to try and play devil's advocate on a few of those things.
It's terrible, don't buy it. So that made it not salesy, right?
No, I think, look, I think with anything and any new emerging tech, and we said it on the podcast before, regardless if it's Enplans or nodes and links or anything out there, OpenAI's
a lot of
products,
exciting stuff as well.
It's
right?
it's still exciting stuff, but I think we've got to understand how we best use it as practitioners.
Absolutely.
So the auto reporting one, the first thing that springs to mind on tens of hundreds of pages of reporting is, when will we actually just get away from reporting like that, the monthly cycle? And because if the data's stored, you can recall it at any stage, right? So why do we have to generate a report to be stored away?
The reason why reports exist, in my view, is when data has to cross a boundary, right? So if you think about when is a report being sent, it's someone, let's think about it in terms of people, right? Someone has access to a report, to a set of data about thing X that they are doing, whatever that may be, right? And somebody outside of the access to that data, but perhaps with authority or contractual relationship or whatever it is that gives them a right to information, asks for information, right? Then person with access to data creates a report, sends over distilled information in the report, but that is that's information that's crossing a boundary. So I think that's basically the pattern, right, for reporting pretty much under almost any circumstance, right? So I think when will we get rid of reporting is probably when will we get rid of reports as the artifact itself? Probably never.
Okay.
Hear me out though. But what we'll get rid of is the act of creating the report and the act of reading the report.
Okay.
Right? So because the report is a packet of information that crosses a boundary, what might happen in the future, and what I hope will happen in the future, is that you'll have agent-to-agent communication where the report is the packet of information. It may be a different format, right? At that point, you don't need a PDF. You can just have a big JSON file that you send over, right? Whatever it is. But it'll be agent-to-agent communication, and then the intended recipient will just talk to their agent to find out what is the thing that they want, right? Or maybe they asked a question to the agent and the agent independently decided to go ask for a report to another agent that it knows the existence of and receives back that packet of information and then summarizes it back and says, hey, I found this. You might want to look at this weird stuff. Why did someone book 20 helicopters when it's a road project, or something like that? I don't know. Trying to point to weird stuff, but
yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's an interesting one because I think when you look at projects and as you say, what is the reason for reporting or submitting reports? I then go into the whole area of, well, what if we didn't have agents or even require agents and everyone just had access directly to the data and didn't have those boundaries where we had to distill the information. And so you could just interrogate it from your end regardless and ask questions. That would remove the need for that. But I get in the current climate, that automating reporting saves a lot of time for people. And I think you stressed it already, but I'll reiterate. For me, this doesn't replace the need to at least review the information before you send it off. Dare I say it, you will have to edit it as well. It just speeds it up for you. It doesn't do the job for you. It just makes it quicker. And
I mean, from an accountability and responsibility point of view, you're accountable for what's being said.
Yeah.
Because if you're using an agent, you're accountable for the agent that you use. And if you're using ChatGPT, you're accountable for how you're using ChatGPT. I think that has become pretty clear in the last couple of years, right?
Yeah.
So you're still accountable for what information is being shared and how. So yeah, you should always review what's going out if it is sensitive in any way, right? So there may be things that you are not allowed to share, but like how the hell is Auto Report or ChatGPT or anything else supposed to know that those things are, like, for example, classified, right? That would be like the biggest example here. You're reviewing for classified information. So that to me is, obviously a necessary step. But, reading a report or skimming it and making sure that there is no crazy stuff in there, that's a 20-minute job versus a 4-hour job, right? So like now you can spend 3 hours and 40 minutes. I don't know. If you don't have extra work to do, you can play Tetris or something. But
how does it?
Most of us are really busy, and so you could do with those extra 3 hours and 40 minutes, right?
Yes. No, absolutely. Time is precious these days.
I think the really cool stuff starts happening when, maybe you have project controls reporting to project director. Project director asks for a report that they might have to share to someone like an SRO or whatever that's doing some sort of governance, right? And the project, like, you generate the report, but also on the other side, the project director is using ChatGPT to review the report, and then the SRO, when they receive it, they just plug it into ChatGPT and start asking questions that they're interested in, right? Because then nobody has to read 200 pages and nobody has to write 200 pages, but there just exists 200 pages of information that is accessible if you need it.
Yeah. Are we at risk then, if I go down that rabbit hole, of having hallucinations on top of hallucinations potentially, where you're distilling information the wrong way using large language models, or are they improving that much that risk is decreasing?
I think hallucination, when there's a document in the prompt, is, I'm going to say 1 in 10,000 now, even less.
Okay.
Right?
So it's getting better.
So yeah, in my mind, if you have uploaded a document, it's in prompt. This is also true of retrieval augmented generation. If there is information in context for the LLM, it is almost impossible. No, it's not impossible, right? Because it really isn't impossible by definition, but it is very, very unlikely that you'll see alternative information being generated, right?
And
unless there's like a catastrophic bug in ChatGPT or something, which I wouldn't exclude that those things may happen transiently at some point, right? But then that will be a case where like ChatGPT starts hallucinating for the entire world and they roll back within 15 minutes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think one of the questions that a lot of people that are adverse to using the tech will ask is, well, how does it get all of the context? It doesn't go to site. It doesn't understand all of the different variables. Is it all just based on assumptions? How does it create the wider context to give you a holistic report?
Yeah, so like, I mean, this is what you would typically do, even if you're asking ChatGPT to generate a report for you based on information you have, right? You have to upload other information. So if you, and this is crucial, right? If you don't have the information available, you're not going to get it out of the model, right? Because that means that information doesn't exist. I could ask ChatGPT what's happening in my room right now, but unless I give it a photo of my room, which is not going to happen because it's incredibly untidy, it's not going to know. and that's kind of the same thing, right? Like, so in Autoreport specifically, we've made it so that you can upload any document, right? Like even
pictures, videos, voice.
Pictures and videos are coming. I think they're not in the first release. We were going to put them in the first release. We had a couple of bugs where like silly stuff with like pre-processing images and all that kind of pre-processing videos, all that kind of stuff, right? It wasn't a problem with the models or anything like that. So I imagine that, like, in a couple of months you'll be able to also give pictures and videos and that kind of stuff. And like, it may actually decide to include the pictures in the report. Right. So like, and this is the fun bit, right? Like, you can kind of micromanage, in a sense, the structure of the report. You can say, I want a paragraph here, I want this chart here, I want this other chart over there, and you describe what chart you want, and it automatically generates it for you. But I much more prefer the future where you have a set of models that is smart enough to know I should include this, right? Which is not the stage that we're at right now, right? But like, we see it starting to emerge. So if you go to Barry in the chatbot and you say, I want a report about X, it will generate a couple of charts now, right? And so it does it just deciding what is a good chart here, what is a good chart there, and it might ask you a couple of questions to try and fill in some detail, but it also won't do, the 200-page report. It'll do like, a 2-page thing that you could probably dump in an email, right? And I think that autonomy is where agents should be heading.
So where do I sit with autonomy? I think if I'm representing different people's views, I think there is a trust element when it comes to allowing a computer to have autonomy and agency. Specifically in our industry, I think one of the key blockers is our favorite phrase, strategic misrepresentation, because it won't necessarily tell you what you want it to tell, the story.
I mean, you can tell it what you want it to tell, and then it'll tell it, right? You have to remember to do that, though.
Sure, but then it wouldn't have complete agency, right? In my mind.
I mean, it never will, right? It'll always do the job that you ask it to do, right? It's not that you just like dump an agent in a corner and say go, and it just does things, right? I don't think that's ever going to happen. And it's not that would be impossible in the future, I imagine, but it's more that we're just not going to be interested in building something like that, right? Because it has no real commercial value, right? It'll always be goal oriented, and you'll say like, I want a report. Like if you're talking about like a project progress report, for example, you'll have to say, I want a project progress report, and it's for this person, and it should include these things, right? It's just that right now what you have to do is you have to go through a couple of steps and describe the different sections, etc. Whereas like maybe at some point you'll be able to just literally ask it in 3 sentences, which is easier than what we ask our colleagues now, right? Like I spend not a lot, but a good amount of time examining the type of questions that go through Barry and Autoreport now as well. And the curious thing is that like the way we pose questions to an AI is less tractable, less executable, feasible than what we would ask a colleague to do, right? So like you would never just go to a colleague and say, I need a progress report, go, right? You'd probably give them some pointers of like, first of all, what project is it? But, what you want, who's it for, right? What kind of size of report are you looking for? Is it a report about schedule? Is it a report about generally the state of the project? Blah, 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 right? But maybe eventually you won't have to do those things. Like right now, if you do those things with an LLM, you get good responses. And a lot of people don't. And it's funny, right? Because we basically go into like Google search mode. We've been trained for so many years to be as synthetic and open-ended as possible with search, right? And actually, what we want to do with prompting is the opposite.
Yeah.
Sorry, I went down a little bit of a side chat here, but like I think it's super interesting to see this as like a human pattern, right?
No, it absolutely is. I think we've spoken on previous episodes about prompt engineering and the different ways to approach it, which is great. So listeners, you can go back and listen to those episodes. But when you were talking there, it got me thinking that this whole notion, if you rewind maybe 12, 18 months ago, a lot of people, or even earlier than that, people were talking about, how if we make data freely and openly available, you have more transparency and adding data analytics on top of things and AI. And what we're saying is, kind of feels like we're contradicting it and saying, actually, no, we control the narrative still. And so other than speeding up information and churning it out and giving us more time, is AI or AI applications for improving project delivery and outcomes, is it that much better than humans if we're going to control the narrative anyway? Because one of the things we're saying is that there is this barrier to truly improving outcomes of projects and project delivery because of individuals wanting to control the narrative and not being fully transparent. And that goes all the way through from politicians all the way through to individuals when they're interviewing for job positions. So how do we get past that bit?
You don't. I mean, you just don't, right? Like, I think data sharing from a idealistic perspective is morally correct if you want to window dress it like that, right? Like, and I agree, right? Like, if we were all Vulcans, for those of you that are into Star Trek, that is probably what we would do. But we're not. Controlling narrative is one of the reasons, right? There are also like legitimate, let's call it like more morally legitimate reasons why you would not want to share data. So one of them is that data might have personally identifiable information in it, right? If you're a credit card company, there's no way in hell that you're going to share any of that data anywhere, right? But you may still be able to derive some very useful stuff out of it, right? Because when you start generalizing, you actually end up with macroeconomic indicators of indebtedness of a population, which is actually data that does get used in all sorts of environments, including government, right? It's one of the key data points that gets looked at, like how indebted is our population, what is the debt to savings ratio and that kind of stuff, right? But you have a silo, right? And you have a boundary, and that's where, like, if you want to go back to like this principle of reporting, you have the data, all of the credit card statements, transactions, balances, etc. There's a boundary which you cannot cross, otherwise you go to prison. But you can share something out, and that thing that becomes shareable is, let's call it a form of reporting, right? Because it's extracted data that gets sent to some key stakeholder. Other reasons might be, not so enshrined in law, but you'll have like competitive advantage, right? We see that a lot. Like, we have to do so many different things with our data set because some organizations see their schedules as competitive advantage and their documents as competitive advantage, and we have to provide guarantees to that, etc., 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 right? So each company has their own silo with boundaries that cannot be crossed, but there are things that can go into a general model that just understands what projects are. And that's where it becomes very delicate and very, very fragile, because as soon as you break one of the boundaries, you've broken the trust of the entire system. So yeah, idealistically, data sharing would be amazing, but actually, automating the jumping of boundaries as much as possible, that creates an environment where maybe you don't need to share the data. You can share access to
certain bits
things
of
that
yeah.
you would want to make accessible in the data, right? So it's kind of like if you plonk an agent which has a data scientist module on top of every data set, and it defines its own API. I'm doing air quotes here because it's not going to be a real API, but it defines its own API for other agents so that that agent knows about those things, and you can ask it a question. It can either give you an answer, or it can tell you, I can't tell you that, Dave, because it's classified. But then you've achieved peer to peer, I guess. How would I call it? Peer to peer data networking. That seems like too technical, but it's sort of like basically you're sharing access without sharing the data, right?
Yes.
And I think that is probably where a lot of this is going to end up, because you're not going to get past the law first, and you're not going to get past the fact that people want to retain certain things as privileged information. And if you want to go into like the more nefarious whatever, right, like less morally pure things like strategic misrepresentation, you can encode that in the agent that is safeguarding the data set.
Yeah, which is interesting for people to hear, I think, because there's this whole notion that, data analytics, data sharing will set us free from all of the human traits and behaviors. But how is all of this created?
But this is the problem, right? If you want to get rid of all human traits and behaviors, you have to get rid of all humans. And I'm not in favor of that, but I don't think anybody is.
No, exactly.
Apart from a couple of very, very crazy politicians.
Perhaps. We won't get into politics. We are recording on voting day. So,
yeah.
Very appropriate. I do want to make some time for GraphGen as well, because there will be specifically project planners interested, and schedulers perhaps, in what this means for them. And I mean, you brought up let's talk about the lasagna recipe, Gantt chart. Now, for those
I'll see if I can find a screenshot of it. We have a screenshot somewhere. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous, right? It looks like a construction project.
Or if you want to, folks, reach out to Al and he can post it on his
I can't
LinkedIn
promise that
well.
I still have it, the screenshot, but I'll look for it.
Yeah. Now, a couple of things arise for me is the practicalities for those that didn't see it and weren't at AI Day. How do you just take text and you just paste it in and it generates whatever it feels right, or do you kind of give it the context and say I want an X number line schedule, or what is it that you actually put in? So that's the first thing I'd say.
The demo right now is I literally went to a government website with an RFP, selected the text, dumped it into a text box, pressed one button, and received the schedule. So I let GraphGen choose what to do.
Okay.
The final version of the product, which we're calling Schedule Studio, won't be like that.
Yep.
So it'll be, you can upload documents, you can write a prompt, you can say, these are my scheduling practice guidelines. You can probably upload all sorts of other stuff that GraphGen can refer to.
Okay.
And if you have, GraphGen already knows about this through IceLM, but things like, spawns and all that kind of stuff, and you probably have your own internal rates of production. You can probably put those in. You can give it all sorts of things, right? Like,
so the more context, the more accurate. Yeah. Okay. Because
the thing that it can't read right now is, CAD drawings and that kind of stuff.
Right.
We don't really have it on roadmap either, mostly because there's like so much other stuff. So that's the only thing that isn't there right now, is like basically a BIM model or a CAD drawing or something.
But you can upload a NEC contract or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, you definitely. And if you have a contract, I would advise you should. All right, because then it can start putting contractual milestones in. The contract will say things about penalties, so I can work around those kinds of things. Yeah.
Cool. So okay, so now we know so practically how it would work. Now, the lasagna example. Sorry to come back to it, but
No, it's fine.
how
It's
useful?
a very neutral example. So
Yeah, but how useful is an over elaborate lasagna example, and would that happen? How often would that happen for people that are using it on actual real projects? Because if I'm then to go and generate, let's say, a schedule, and I know, being an experienced planner, that I only need, 1,500 lines, yet it spits out 10,000 lines for me. That's not useful.
no, yeah, it's true. The reality is and this is something that we're planning, is that you do it in an iterative process. But if you have a gut feeling that this should be a 1,500 line schedule, you can just tell it in the prompt, right? If you tell it, there are limits. I think right now we probably can't generate anything more than 2,000 lines. So it would stop at certain levels of detail depending on what the project is. But you can tell it, right? You'll tell it, I need this. This is a big project. I need it to be, typically something like an LNG facility will be a lot of schedule, I guess. And you can tell it, right? What you'll probably get in the first pass is some high level view, couple thousand, but the iterative process that we're designing, which will not be in version 1 but will be rolled out later, is just select some section of the schedule and you tell GraphGen, I want to change this about this section, right? So you have your first version, and then you see that, something is a little bit too summarized. Select that area, and then you type, actually, please expand more detail in this. Or even things like, this is wrong, I want you to do it in a different way. Or we're moving all of this section to off-site fabrication, etc., etc. So that's the goal, I guess, like the user experience that we're going for with it, so that then you can basically iterate as much as possible without having to draw lines in P6 or Microsoft Project. And you're only going into P6 and Microsoft Project as the last stage when you want to do single activity changes.
Okay. So here's I'm still got I've had the devil's advocate hat on ever since.
I like that. I like that.
So there will be some that cynics, let's call them, or people that think, oh, I'm realistic about this, that say, well, okay, that's great. The issue is, if we are learning from past bits of data, right, and using this contextual scope that you're giving it to generate an output of a version of a schedule, one of the things is that, do we truly have a big enough data set that gives truly as-built data? And then secondly, practically, once I've got this, have you gone through the validation of actually the schedule that's been outputted is practically accurate for use?
So I guess one thing to clear up is, like, we don't actually need anybody's data set to be able to generate schedules. You can upload the things that you think are relevant. So if you want to upload other schedules to refer to, and you say, like, we built it like this before, that goes in context. It's great. It helps, right? And this is, when you see repetitive projects, I think of wind farms, for example, right? Siemens have done this thing where they've basically standardized the planning for all this, I think it's Siemens, I'm not sure. All the wind farms that they're building across the world, and they just send out a ready-made schedule for a project manager. But there's always going to be some tweak, right? Because the ground is never going to be exactly the same, and the size of the farm might not actually be the same. So, like, there's some adaptation, but you have the data of how you've done it before, right? So this is useful information. And you can plunk in as much information as you want, right? There are limits on context, but we can get around most of the context limits of LLMs by using multiple stages. So that becomes useful. I guess, like, the second part of the question, has this been validated? yes and no, right? It's a new schedule every time. So that specific schedule won't have been validated. We've done a lot of rounds of reinforcement learning with human feedback, etc. And during the beta phase, we're basically asking people to tell us what they would change about a schedule, and we'll make it make tweaks to either the model or the process or whatever else is happening under the hood, right? But the reality is that you should not expect it to be a fully validated, perfect schedule for your project ever, right? The analogy that I've been using is if you want to write a document, probably you don't start from a blank Word document anymore, right? You can go to ChatGPT and ask it for like an outline of the document and maybe sketch out a couple of paragraphs. You might ask it to then fill in some bits, and you get basically your first draft done in ChatGPT. Then you paste it into Word, and then you might be even using Copilot to help you rewrite some bits, but you're also, doing the layout as well as adding your own flavor to the things that you don't like because they weren't generated with your own voice, etc. And if you've written 5 books before and you upload those into context of Chat GPT, it's going to be a lot better, but you're still going to have to edit it, right? And it is very clear, like, there's academic papers, there's documents, there's all sorts of stuff where people have just blindly uploaded stuff that came out of ChatGPT without checking it, and it's absolutely awful, and we can all recognize those, right? The LinkedIn posts that start with a headline between 2 emojis, like, I just skip over those now because I know that they've been generated.
What about things like, so a whole host of things come up when I think about, scheduling a project plan. There's so many different ways that you could schedule something, the same project.
Yeah.
There's different methodologies, type planning, lean, critical chain, all these types of things, agile, all various ways of thinking of how to construct a project plan and have a schedule that follows that. Are those things you can include as well? First would be my first question. And
Absolutely.
Then secondly, I'm thinking, okay, if I do have this now, and let's say I do have a pretty large generated schedule that's fully logic linked and fully compliant with DCMA, but yet in the early stages, I recognize that the links aren't quite how they should be because that's just practically not how it would be delivered because of some factors that, just through experience I know. And so does that mean then I have to unpick everything, or do I feed that back in to the model to regenerate me a new schedule? Because the thing I'm thinking is if I have to go and unpick it now and it's resource loaded and it's got all the logic links and there's different critical paths, then it's better for me just to start from scratch and do it myself.
That is true, right? So like this is why we're thinking about the iterative process. So that's where you'd have that iterative process, where there's probably like 2 different subcases, 3 actually here. One is the schedule looks weird, right? And everything looks weird because it's been planned in a way that isn't what we expect to, right? So in that case, you would probably just, you keep going with the prompt and you say, actually, this schedule doesn't look right. And you'd have some macro reason, right? One that I can think of is that the schedule's been planned for on-site concrete casting, and actually, like, oh no, we've got a factory sort of setup, so we're going to do off-site fabrication for everything, right? That is not something that you want to go and edit manually. But now, imagine the situation where you're a planner, somebody tells you, we're going to go and build this project, and you never get told, I mean, unlikely, but you never get told that this was going to be an off-site fabrication job for all those things, right? So you plan it, quote unquote, normally. You spend several weeks, come up with something, and then you're told, actually, no, this is off-site prefab, right? Think of the amount of work and frustration that would ensue by having to do that, right? So instead, right, just make it a prompt saying, no, sorry, it's offsite fabrication. Then you wait. I think schedule generation now is a minute, 2 minutes. Like for the difficult stuff, we might end up 5 or 10 minutes, right? So you just go make a cup of tea, come back, you have a different version. And this is where, I'm going to go back to like my personal belief, which is just generate as many futures as you can and then pick the one you like, right? It's still the same principle that underpins the rest of Enplan. Generate as many versions as you want and then pick one that looks right. The second subcase is there's a section of the schedule that looks wrong, right? So like, oh, this is not how approvals work in this legislation. You can select the region of the schedule and you describe the problem, the GraphGen, and you may have to give it some supporting data, right? Like if you say this is not how approvals work in this country that we're going to build in, but you don't tell it where and what the legislation is, well, it's going to be hard for a model or anyone to guess, right? But if you do that, then you can probably get a revised version that looks better. And then the third case is probably like the one where you probably do want to drop into P6 or Microsoft Project or Power Project. Other scheduling tools are available. Where there's like a couple of links that don't look quite right? Like, well, actually, we know that this approval blocks all that other set of work as well, right? And then, but I would save those for the end, because then you download, you're out of Schedule Studio, you're into P6, and you're just drawing extra lines that you believe need to be there, right? Based on what you know about the project and the stakeholders, etc., etc., etc.
And if you don't tell it, what is the default confidence level that it applies to the schedule? Is it a P50, P80? I know we're sort of going down Monte Carlo here, but how are risks built in and considered?
They aren't. This is the fun part, right? Because because Sonnet now is no longer just predicting relative duration of an activity, we can actually get a lot of different things in. But like one of the things that we're doing under the hood is getting activity duration from Sonnet. It's like we don't have to tell it that we're targeting a specific probability. You can do that afterwards, right? So you can what we're doing here is like best estimation, and it's kind of what you do when you're doing, like, what's my planned day. It's your best estimation of what it should take, right? So it's not a p-value, it's more your, I guess if you want to use a statistical term, what you're looking for is the mode.
Yep.
Right? But the mode is different for all sorts of different reasons in all sorts of different contexts, right? And production rates and resources enter into that. The cool thing is that then you can plug it into the forecasting, right? It's like, this is actually probably going to be one of those things where we just add a button after you created the schedule. I just want to plonk this into forecasting and look at the results of the risk analysis, right? But the third cool thing is that now GraphGen has the logic optimizer, right? So the logic optimizer, you can say, I'm going to assume a certain scenario. I want to minimize the distribution to the left just by reorganizing the schedule. We don't do that automatically in schedule generation because we don't know what sort of things you're thinking at. We're more, the thing that's more important at that point is the structure. But you can then plug it into Logic Optimizer as well, right? You can say, I always use this as a form of, we didn't expect this to happen and it's nobody's fault on a project, because it's a neutral, non-toxic example. But you find badger sets. I want to know what happens if I find badger sets. Well, there's going to be badger relocation activities showing up, all that kind of stuff. That you don't put it in the plan schedule, but you put it in the scenario, right? And so you optimize that scenario, and you can start thinking about causal modeling in that way. And you can also just say, I want to
optimize the base case and you find a way of getting the best PAT that you want, but we'll do that as a second stage, and that is part of normal Enplan insights, right? Rather than schedule generation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does.
Sorry, I get carried away by this because like when you start plugging all the bits together, you could go into like so many directions, and my product team hate me because I just do these massive unloads onto them every once in a while, and they're like, yeah, but you know that we're like 40 people in the company, you know, 50, whatever it is, right? 60, I don't know.
Yeah, just create agents, and that you don't need to expand the team.
Yeah, sure, right? Like, there's only so much GitHub Copilot can do.
No, exactly. Look, it was fascinating unpicking that with you, El, because we look at other products out in the market and how that can help us. And so, for me, certainly, I like I say, I know you didn't sort of want to make this a salesy one. I don't think we did that. But I felt that based on what you shared with the world, those that didn't see it need to know what's out there. And with anything, the best way is to try it for yourself. So just try it. You'll know what works, what doesn't work. I know you're open now to feedback on things that don't work as well. You've just said it.
Auto report is on a free trial. You don't even need to have insights, or I think you need to have a schedule at some point during that process. But
yeah, just try it. Get in touch with El and the team as well. And yeah, feedback, whether it's via this podcast, whether it's via El directly, me, whoever. Because the whole intent is actually to share so that we can improve the way projects are delivered. So hopefully, folks, you've got a lot out of this one. I certainly did as well.
Yeah. Sorry for descending too much into it.
No, I think it was spot on, Al, and I think it was timely as well, because this one specifically, because what you do is in the sweet spot of the audience that listens to us in the project space. So it's all well and good talking about OpenAI and Microsoft and all those types of things. That's interesting, but what is appropriate to this industry and how do we move forward, I think is far more appropriate.
And we've talked about this before, right? Like Copilot, ChatGPT, Claude, etc. Like they're very powerful tools, but what they're targeting is what I would call business ops, right? It's that flat layer that goes over the top of all businesses rather than the vertical domain specific product.
Yes, absolutely. But look, we're heading towards the end of this episode, and it's also been a lot of fun once again. Any final thoughts you want to put out into the ether?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of news that we haven't covered. I think there's a lot of new models that have come out, right? Like there's have we had an episode since Claude 3.5 Sonnet was launched? And like this is the other thing, right? We decided to call our foundation model for schedules Sonnet, and then 2 weeks later Claude launched their Claude 3 Sonnet. And we're like, can we come up with a better name? And we just kept it.
I haven't seen a Barry elsewhere. There's only one Barry I've seen.
Yeah, I think Barry and Nerd are the two names that are safe for now. Yeah.
There you go.
But yeah, it's interesting. There's Runway Gen 3. There's a lot of other stuff. There's like a lot of people have moved organizations as well, right? So like there's a lot of news that we haven't covered. It's all interesting. I just think it's just going to keep going at this pace. Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, one thing that I found interesting is GPT-4.0 seems to hallucinate things a lot more than 4 Turbo. And actually, this is maybe for the audience. Have you noticed anything like that? Because for certain things, right, like we don't only use our own internal LLMs. For certain things, we actually rely on Claude or GPT-4. And we've had to drop GPT-4 in many places. Drop back to 4 Turbo or drop to Claude or Gemini, because I say drop, actually. Claude 3.5 is really good. But mostly because 4.0 does seem to invent things.
So I've managed to get it to invent URLs for images that it thinks it's created, but it don't exist. This is just straight in ChatGPT, right? And it's
I will say when I've used it, I've had to double check a couple of times. So then you go back to Turbo. But it'd be interesting, as you say, put the call out. You've put the call out to the listeners. Feedback, please, as always. There's LinkedIn. Direct message us if you want
and
as well.
Tell me your stories, even the ones where you think I'm wrong, right? Like in GPT-4.0 did a lot better than Turbo, not just on speed.
Absolutely.
Like we know that 4.0 is a lot faster, but I suspect that it's a much smaller model.
Yes, absolutely. But look, folks, we're not going to take too much more of your time. Thank you so much for spending almost an hour with us. Hopefully we've entertained you. We've shared some valuable information. Please do reach out if you think we can improve what we're doing. The followers, the subscribers, the listeners are growing every single episode. So we truly, truly appreciate you tuning in to us for each one.
Tell your friends about the podcast.
Yeah, tell your friends about the podcast. And yeah, keep the comments coming. Until next time, we'll say bye for now.
Bye.